Thanks. I'm going to talk a bit about technology assessment and how it may be applied to gene drives in this issue, along with some moves to build capacity for technology assessment in this area. A little bit about the background of technology assessment. This arose in the mid-1960s. The idea was that there are a lot of technological advances post-World War II, and we started to see that there were unintended, indirect, sometimes harmful consequences from these. Actually, there were some consequences that were favorable that were unintended. In any case, the term technology assessment per se was introduced in the mid-1960s. And you can see at the third bullet there some of the examples of the early topics of technology assessment. So it's been around for a while and it's evolved over time. Well, what is technology assessment? I think this is one of the best definitions that I've come across, and you can see that it is a category of policy studies. It's to provide decision-making support about possible impacts and consequences of technology. It cares about both direct and indirect or secondary consequences, both the benefits and the disbenefits. It's not only looking for downside, it's looking for upside too, and involves mapping uncertainties involved. And of course, in this area of gene drives, there are a lot of uncertainties, and that's part of the process. And the idea is to come up with an ordered set of analyzed policy options and some understanding of their implications for more broad ideas, the economy, the environment, social, political, and legal processes. So that's a good definition of technology assessment. And important, and I think quite relevant here, are a couple of basic orientations of technology assessment. You know, you can start with a particular technology, gizmo X, drug Y, gene editing technique Z, whatever it is. Those are technology-oriented, but then there are problem-oriented assessments that say, well, wait a minute, we're not starting with some particular technology itself, we're looking at a problem. So what's the problem? Well, the problem may be mortality and morbidity associated with malaria. What are the ways to kind of go at that with sets of technologies or strategies? Project-oriented assessments are more specific or site-specific. Where here in our hospital or in our water supply system we're going to try a particular sort of intervention as a project. So TA can have several different sorts of basic orientations, and I want to highlight this because when we're looking at any particular problem, public health or otherwise, we're thinking maybe you don't always start with the device or the molecule or the technique in particular. We continue to think broadly about the problem we're trying to solve. Now, health technology assessment is a particular application, and here is a definition of it that is very similar to one I showed you. It involves a systematic evaluation of properties, effects, or other impacts. Its main purpose is to inform policymaking. TA or HTA is not the policy, it's to support or inform policymaking. Again, direct and indirect consequences, and indirect and unintended. So those are all covered. It's conducted by interdisciplinary groups. If you only have one type of expert around the table, you're not doing technology assessment. And it's not just multidisciplinary, it's interdisciplinary. People need to work together. It involves one or more analytical frameworks. Now, when we think about healthcare technology, I want to emphasize something. When we do work in HTA, health technology assessment, look at how broad we consider to be health technology. Yes, it's drugs. Yes, it's biologics, including vaccines and so forth, devices, equipment, supplies. And it's not just high-tech or low-tech. This can be anything from a pacemaker to an MRI scanner to mosquito netting. It's also medical and surgical procedures. Indeed, it can involve public health programs, whether it's water purification or smoking prevention, support systems, a clinical laboratory, even electronic health record system, and even how we organize, deliver, and manage systems in healthcare. These are all types of technology. These are all types of technology, and the use of TA methods and approaches can apply in various forms across a very broad spectrum of technology. Well, in health technology assessment in particular, what are some of the sorts of things that are assessed? Well, the technical properties of a device, let's say a test, its sensitivity and specificity, or if it's an MRI scanner, the resolution, safety, including side effects and adverse events, efficacy, which is not the same as effectiveness. We know that things work at a certain level under ideal, best laboratory conditions, but we often know once something gets out in the environment, out in the community, out in the field, it may not work as well or it may work differently. So we typically don't want to be satisfied with evidence about efficacy only. Cost and other economic attributes, of which there are many, and of course social, legal, ethical, and or political impacts. So those are 5 very broad categories of properties or impacts that can be assessed in at least HTA. Now, with regard to gene-derived disease transmission in mosquitoes, look at, you've got, as I understand it, maybe at least three main options that you see there and a set of potential consequences. This is part of the scope of concern here, or focus. Options. Are you looking at any one of those particular options and focusing on those? Are you looking at those as a set of options? Are you looking at these as a set of options within a broader set of options or strategies? What's the scope of the assessment here? And of course, looking here at potential consequences, there are obviously some upsides and downsides here. That's just the beginning of a set of impacts or consequences, intended or otherwise, that may be part of the assessment. Now, there are many, many frameworks for technology assessment. There's no single way to do it, and gosh, just here's a collection of frameworks that have been put forth in technology assessment. There are many. My point is to say that there's no single way of doing this. There are many approaches, many frameworks for this, and you need to adapt and apply accordingly, depending on the level of technology that you're looking at, or the scope of the assessment, I should say, the methods and resources available, and so forth. So there's no shortage of frameworks from which to choose or from which to adapt. Now, as you look at the changes in the field of technology assessment, I want to call attention to some of the ways in which the field is being modified or is adapting. I'm calling your attention to this because as we think about what you want to do with gene drives and how you may want to involve citizens and consumers and experts and decision makers, some of the new approaches to TA are suggesting a lot more participatory aspects, a lot more insofar as quick turnaround, a lot more insofar as real time, and so forth. So we have something called now participatory TA. Get everybody involved in a certain way. Real-time TA, learn as you go. Interactive or integrative participatory TA, again, ways of getting different groups, although including people with different levels of expertise to participate in TA. Open source, third generation, and horizon scanning, which is kind of what's coming over the horizon, what's new, how do we get ready for it. So there are a variety of new approaches to technology assessment, and we can learn from these, and they also help to sort of track trends in the field. One in particular, calling your attention to this, I think highlights some points that may be useful to you. Among the interactive approaches, there's something called the analytic deliberative model. I don't mean to highlight this in particular or say it's the best, but note some aspects of it. It's recursive or iterative. It depends on systematic analysis that's appropriate to the problem. It treats uncertainties in a comprehensible way. Think about gene drive. What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? There are a lot of uncertainties in this field. And by the way, in a comprehensible way, can you describe uncertainties in ways in which your participants will all get it and in which your decision makers can understand? They need to understand where your uncertainties are. It is early. It starts early. It is participative. It provides explicit attention to the formulation of the problem. And by the way, you need a lot of input on formulation of the problem. How we might formulate this problem based on people that live in North America or Western Europe is going to be a little bit different or a lot different from people in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, and also across those areas, different levels of comprehension, expertise, and types of people in the community. There's a deliberation that frames the analysis, and the analysis informs deliberation. Get that? We deliberate in a way to frame our analysis, our scope, and our approach. And as we start our analysis, it feeds back to re-inform our deliberation. We revisit early framing choices, and we continue to account for the provisionality of people's judgments. You don't get locked into a single approach. Note as well, participation and representation of what? A spectrum of interested and affected parties and decision makers and specialists at each step, not just some at the beginning or the end. Don't just bring in the citizens at the very end of the process. That's not going to work. And by the way, there's always the option to say no to particular visions of progress. Not everyone's going to agree, or you're going to learn as we go and decide that an original vision of progress may not be what is feasible now or what is acceptable now. Now, there are various methods or techniques that are used in technology assessment, and I just threw a bunch of them together on one slide just to give you an idea of the diversity here of a toolkit. You can look at them in terms of categories or dimensions. There's primary data collection versus secondary or integrative analyses that use primary data. So primary data collection versus secondary integrative. Also quantitative methods and techniques versus qualitative ones. Then there are those that are used typically by experts for certain forms of analysis or participatory deliberative approaches. And here you see a couple of columns worth of techniques or methods in no particular order. The idea again is that there is a toolkit, and I should say an evolving toolkit of methods available for use. Please keep this in mind, and I'm going to stress the aspect of participatory technology assessment and engaging consumers. Keep in mind that all science is local, all right? The utility is local. We do have compelling results from clinical trials and other formal studies, and of course we need this, but the opinions, perspectives, and lived wisdom of communities from the grassroots to the grass tops, these are important as well. How communities absorb, understand, and prioritize the science does matter. This is no less important when we're looking at something like gene drives for reducing transmission of mosquito-borne diseases. Citizen participation methods, a particular subset of methods that have been used by citizens or consumers as part of the HTA process are these. There's a set of deliberative methods, people involved in consensus conferences, citizens, juries, and panels, a multidisciplinary planning cells, even scenario analyses and workshops and so forth. Consultation through surveys, public meetings, focus groups, and voting conferences, even referenda in some instances, and keeping in mind that there are multi-stage methods. That is, you can use one or more of these in sequence or in parallel depending upon your circumstances. Citizen participation methods. Now, it's always helpful to draw a picture in identifying the possibilities. And I like the one that was done in a study, an assessment of nanotechnologies. And first of all, drawing the picture helps everyone. Certainly the experts, it forces them to be specific, but something like this that is not only made available to consumers and citizens, but may even engage them in assembling something like this is, how is this going to work? Can you show in a pictorial form what you're trying to do? And in this case, it was production of nanotechnologies. You produce them, you transport them, you store them, you have products, and you put them out. But there are other ways in which these things might leak out, for good or for worse. They might get into the air, the water, or the diet, and they may kind of feedback and maybe inflict some adverse effects or unintended consequences on consumers. And by the way, it's a really good idea to consult consumers about the ways in which they think they are at risk, and or to inform them about potential risks and get their input on understanding which are the important ones. How do they weigh risks and benefits? The point is, draw the picture, get people to understand the picture, involve people in drawing the picture. With regard to citizen input, this is a pretty good example of why something just so simple can be so important. Looking at the adoption of bed nets for malaria prevention in Western Kenya. Low adoption. What was the problem? Well, you had to talk to some people in the community to find out that some of them said that they had a similarity to white nets, the white nets to burial shrouds, and they weren't too excited about that. So when they changed the color of the malaria nets, uptake was improved. So, and this can save a lot of money and improve efficiency. Citizen input, just ask. Now, in the field of HTA, health technology assessment, I want to try to help illustrate how valuable input can be, even in so-called complex or high technologies. How can they participate? How have they participated? Well, they can help in the establishment of a TA program, patients and consumers. They can serve as members of boards, committees, and work groups. They can identify and set priorities among potential topics for technology assessment. They can frame the assessment questions. By the way, those are not the same things. Setting priorities among HTA topics is one, but then now that you've got the topic, what are the questions? What are you probing? What is the inquiry? You need and would appreciate input from citizens on that as well. Early identification of potential target groups, who's going to use these reports and these findings. You want to run a study and prepare a report in a way that's going to be comprehensible to your target audiences. Getting their input on impacts or outcomes to be assessed. What's important to you? We've done some work in oncology and cancer and other chronic and acute diseases, and it's very surprising to hear what patients think about is important and what goals and outcomes they're trying to achieve versus their doctors. Very different sometimes. They can review proposals or bids from outside groups to help conduct or do technical parts of the TAs. Patients and consumers can submit data or evidence for technology assessments, even streaming through their phones for that matter. They can review draft reports and recommendations. They can help to design and prepare patient or consumer-friendly report summaries. They can be helpful in disseminating the findings to policymakers, patient groups, or other target groups. And they, too, can be involved in evaluating the use and impact of the technology assessment recommendations or findings. Why am I showing you this set of points? These are ways in which patients and consumers can be and have been involved in some what would appear to be complex topics, but they're very important ways or avenues to get their input. Now, there are even sets of quality standards for patient involvement in health technology assessment, and I think a lot of these would be applicable to the kinds of things we're talking about here in technology assessment more broadly. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but these are ways that we know or can discern whether or not patients and consumers are involved in technology assessment processes. This is generated by the Health Technology Assessment International Interest Group, subgroup for patient and citizen involved in HTA. They have quality standards for the general process, and they've got quality standards for the individual health technology assessments themselves. So there has been work done on understanding or explaining how to do this well. With regard to capacity building and health technology assessment, here's one example. UNETA, which is a European group, has put together a handbook on capacity building. Although it was developed largely by people in Europe, its points are very well, often applicable to other parts of the world, certainly. They have various examples of how to set up health technology assessment agencies or bodies or functions, how they might be related to other groups. Please note in particular here, and this is why I included this slide, that any HTA body or function is in a helpful way involved in a network of national, even international research institutions, professional associations, other bodies, and related to other international efforts in the area. Even more broadly, part of an international network. In the case of gene drives, no one country, no one agency, no one committee is going to do this on their own. With regard also to capacity building, there are training efforts and efforts around the world to try to develop capacities. This is a recent one in the Asia-Pacific region. This was headed up by the folks in the Philippines and in Thailand and in Singapore with input from NICE International based in the UK. So there's capacity building there as an example. Drawing from the work of UNETA and others, you can identify a set of essential elements to establish an HTA program. You don't need to do all these every time, but these are the ones that you'd like to put together to support a long-standing and viable program. A very important point, I think that this is played out in the field of at least health technology assessment that would be valuable more broadly, is that it's hard to do this stuff without international collaborations. HTA groups, agencies, offices, functions, public sector, private sector are engaged in a variety of collaborations and networks in the field. The Cochrane collaboration is great on systematic reviews. HT Asia Link is a group about 4 years old of new HTA programs and some existing ones in Asia in particular. A new group formed recently in Latin America. Even more recently, there's the Southern African HTA Society. It just formed last year. And so you can see that to do this well, especially, in developing countries where there are limited resources, it's so important to be able to draw more broadly on broader expertise, evidence appraisal approaches, systematic reviews, and so forth. HTA programs, or educational programs in HTA, here are some examples of those. These happen to be, again, in HTA. There's some other efforts in TA more broadly. Some of these are master's degrees programs and so forth. Although many of these seem to be centered in Europe, North America, a lot of them engage people from around the world who come visit and take part in these programs. So there are educational programs in HTA and some more broadly in TA as well. A little bit note here about realistic expectations. We know that we'd like to get citizens and experts and stakeholders and governments to work together. We also know that some of these programs are often subject to limitations in governance around the world, and we just want to make sure that we realize that resources and capacity to do TA may not be available to act on the TA outputs and subsequent political decisions. We have to communicate this in advance to avoid raising false hopes. What can we practically accomplish here? Who is on board? Even so, with new models of technology assessment, when people do participate in these efforts and they make them transparent and their findings are made publicly available, there is learning, there is influence that does occur. And rather than presenting an additional burden, these innovative models can offer ways to help address challenges and build new capacity. So in any of these, because so many agencies and groups and actors are involved, we want to set and understand realistic expectations. It also tells us and suggests to us that we want to pull into the process people in those agencies, governments, and other decision makers, want to engage them directly. Now, I've got a couple slides in summary to talk about some suggestions for you insofar as what you can do for technology assessment here, and especially drawing from the attributes of some of the new models that I listed originally. Really important, joint participation of citizens, stakeholders, and technical experts. Not isolated participation, joint participation. In what? What are the issues or problems to be addressed? What are the questions we're going to ask? What are the criteria for assessment? We want to elicit different perspectives of the benefits, risks, preferences, and values. This is an important point because we don't expect, as I say here, not everyone's got to become an expert in TA, but it is up to all of us to come up with methods that can elicit from citizens, consumers, and other stakeholders what their different perspectives are of benefits and risks, what they prefer, what they value. That's bringing them into the process. Doing this helps to strengthen connections across these participants and the flow of information among them, and it will enable more robust response to uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen with environmental release. We don't know about social, cultural, economic effects here. We need the input of these people to get ideas about some of the things that could happen and how what the probabilities might be around them and how important they are relative to each other. We want to ensure transparency and documentation of the process. There is the support of a democratic legitimacy and accountability. Look, everyone was involved in this process. You weren't brought in at the very end. You were part of it. And with that, people will gain buy-in, we hope, for implementation. So joint participation. Next, do consider the range of technological interventions in multiple applications or contexts. Sometimes TA goes off on too narrow a road with just a single technology in a set of prevailing applications or contexts. More problem-oriented as opposed to single technology, more problem-oriented in multiple applications or contexts. The process should be networked to draw on distributed capacity and expertise, widen participation, and increased efficiency. This is particularly helpful in resource-constrained contexts. Again, not everybody is going to be an expert in TA, not everybody can be an expert in TA. We don't have the resources for that. But what we can do is set up networks where we can draw on international expertise, draw on an international range of citizen input, understand the inputs and views of stakeholders across the board, share data, share evidence, share methodology. In a case like gene drives, yes, transnational. This is going to be a transnational effort. Mosquitoes don't know borders. To the extent possible, virtual, using web platforms, mobile telephone networks. How do we stay in touch with all of our stakeholders? Virtual is going to be very important there. And yes, flexible, open to adaptation and improvement. We can learn from various approaches in the literature and elsewhere from resource-poor conditions of developing countries. We can see how some of these things can be made to work. Address the distribution of benefits and risks to multiple stakeholder groups over time. This is really important. Sometimes TA says, well, the total net benefit or the total net risk is going to be such and such in a certain time slot. Actually, people, benefits and risks accrue differently to different stakeholders, and they accrue differently to different stakeholders over time. So we need to understand who's going to be helped, who's going to be harmed, to what extent, in what ways over time. That's a better consideration of benefits and risks. We need to draw on the best available evidence and seek multiple sources where possible and link them where appropriate. This is a broader development in TA and, by the way, in HTA very much. We understand that data and evidence may be more limited and less reliable in developing countries, and that may require methodological innovation. We do want to draw on best available evidence. Best available isn't always perfect. Best available isn't always high tier, but we do our best with the available evidence. Identify and establish horizon scanning and early warning function. Things are changing. Things are changing the technology and people's understanding of it in its application. Once these things do get out there, so to speak, we're going to learn a lot fast about that. We need to be on top of it. We have to have a more explicit and rigorous approach to incomplete knowledge that is incertitude. What is it in our technology assessment report that accounts for what we don't know? Can we assign probabilities? Keep in mind there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. We need to be explicit about that. A lot of variables here. This is real-time learning, and it is iterative. It's not just look at literature that was available within the last 5 years and make a one-time finding of it. We need to learn as we go, and we need to keep going in an iterative process. And as noted earlier, we want to draw on a broad toolkit of methods. We want to open and enable outputs to plural policy options. Please get this. Please, I hope you'll consider this. Any technology assessment can generate one policy option or multiple policy options. Chances are you're going to be thinking about plural policy options as opposed to a single definitive output. In other words, there's more than one way to do this. That will help to recognize that there are multiple stakeholder perspectives and priorities. There are multiple applications and contexts. There is a range of inherent and sometimes irreducible uncertainties involved, and of course a conditionality of stated assumptions. It's hard to look at all these variables and say that you're going to have a single definitive output. Are there multiple outputs that could accrue here? And as we learn over time, we may hone those down or we may expand them. This further enables flexibility and readiness for the technological options. So I will stop there, and I will end in stopping. I'm going to take you back to that slide, and hope we still have a little bit of time for questions. Back to you.
Thank you, Cliff.